When did you realize your parents were total hypocrites? You're 13 now, which means you can buy your own school lunch, my mom said while signing a permission slip one day. We're not made of money, and you need to learn the value of hard work. That's when she also stopped buying me basic school supplies. Figure it out, she said when I asked for new notebooks and pens. Other kids your age have jobs, so maybe you should too. I felt embarrassed and confused asking teachers for extra supplies while my dad watched his expensive sports package that cost more per month than my entire school supply list. They'd just bought themselves a brand new 6.0-inch TV, but apparently couldn't afford a $5 pack of pencils. I started babysitting on weekends and walking dogs after school, just to afford basic necessities like clothes and food. The shame of wearing jeans that were too short and shoes with holes burned in my chest, but I tried to act like everything was fine. Look at our little entrepreneur, Dad would joke when I came home exhausted from working. Maybe now you'll understand why we can't just hand you everything on a silver platter. I'd smile and nod while calculating in my head how to stretch $20 across a week of lunches. By 14, they'd stopped buying me food entirely while ordering takeout for themselves 3 times a week. I'd come home starving to find them eating restaurant meals and empty cabinets. You could get a job at the grocery store and buy your own food like an adult, Mom would say, eating her Chinese takeout. The smell of their food made my stomach ache, but I learned to stay in my room until they finished so I wouldn't have to watch them enjoy meals I couldn't afford. I got better at managing money than my parents ever were because I had to make every dollar count. While they impulse bought gadgets and restaurant meals, I researched every purchase and hunted for the best deals. I started a small business doing yard work and pet sitting that brought in decent money. The irony was that I had more financial discipline as a teenager than they did as adults, but they still mocked me for being poor when I wore thrift store clothes. It's embarrassing having a daughter who dresses like she's homeless, Mom said when I wore a secondhand dress to a family event. People are going to think we don't take care of you. I wanted to scream that they literally hadn't taken care of me, hadn't bought me clothes in 3 years. Dad would complain to his friends about how expensive kids were while I sat there knowing I'd been financially independent since middle school. I expanded my business and started making real money doing lawn care and pet services for half the neighborhood. My parents acted like my success was somehow thanks to their tough love approach. See what happens when you stop enabling kids and make them work for what they want, Dad would tell people. She's learned the value of a dollar, unlike these spoiled brats whose parents just hand them everything. He said this while sipping $30 bottles of wine and playing golf at the country club. Then Dad got laid off from his job and suddenly their whole attitude toward money flipped. We're going through a rough patch financially, Mom explained while asking if I could loan them money for groceries, just until your father finds something new. I watched them panic over missing one mortgage payment while I'd been budgeting down to the penny for years. They had no savings despite making good money, because they'd spent every dollar on wants instead of needs. You've got all that money just sitting in your account, Dad said when I refused to give them cash. Family helps family during hard times. I reminded him that family was supposed to help family when I was 13 and eating peanut butter for dinner every night. That was different because we were teaching you responsibility, Mom said. Like that made any sense. This is a real emergency. They kept asking for money every few days and got angrier each time I said no. You're being selfish and ungrateful after everything we've done for you, Dad said during one of his begging sessions. We could have kicked you out years ago, but we let you live here for free. I pointed out that letting your minor child live in your house was the legal minimum requirement for parents. Don't get smart with us when we're asking for help, Mom snapped back. I was counting my savings and planning to move out for college when both my parents cornered me in the kitchen with serious expressions. We've been talking and we think it's time for you to start contributing to household expenses, Mom said while Dad nodded behind her. You're 15 now and you make good money, so it's only fair that you pay rent. Dad stepped closer with a contract in his hands. $500 a month plus utilities, or you can find somewhere else to live. I stared at the contract in Dad's hands and my mind went completely blank for a second. The paper had official-looking headers and lines for signatures, and $500 a month plus utilities meant I'd be paying nearly everything I earned, leaving almost nothing for food or emergencies. I did the math in my head fast. Between my lawn care business and the pet sitting, I bring in about $600 on a good month. Utilities in this house run at least another $150 during summer when they blast the air conditioning. That would leave me $50 for everything else. Food, clothes, school supplies, gas for the mower, everything. My parents were watching me like they expected me to just sign. Mom had her arms crossed and Dad was holding out a pen. I told them I needed time to think and retreated to my room before they could argue. Dad called after me about being dramatic, but I closed my door and locked it. My hands shook as I pulled out my budget notebook and ran the numbers, confirming what I already knew. This would destroy everything I'd built. I'd been so careful with every dollar for 3 years. I had $2,000 saved up for emergencies and college application fees. If I paid them rent, that savings would be gone in 4 months, and I'd have nothing left for the basics they stopped providing. I wrote out different scenarios, but they all ended the same way. There was no version where this worked without me going hungry or losing my business equipment. The notebook pages blurred a little because my eyes were watering, but I wasn't crying. I was just angry and scared and trying to figure out what to do. That night I lay awake researching on my phone whether parents could legally charge their minor child rent. The answers were confusing and varied by state, but most sources agreed parents have a duty to provide basic support until 18. Some forums had people saying their parents charged them rent as teenagers and it worked out fine. Others said it counts as neglect if the parents aren't providing food and necessities. I found a legal aid website stating parents have to give kids shelter, food, clothing, medical care, and education. Charging rent might be acceptable if they're still providing all that other stuff, but my parents hadn't bought me food in over a year. They hadn't bought me clothes since I was 12. I screenshotted everything that seemed relevant and saved it in a folder on my phone. Around 2 inches the morning, I finally fell asleep with my phone still in my hand. When my alarm went off, I felt exhausted and my eyes ached from reading tiny text for hours. The next morning, I told my parents I wasn't signing anything until I talked to someone at school about it. We were in the kitchen and they were eating breakfast they'd bought for themselves. Dad's face turned red and he started yelling about disrespect. He said I was being ungrateful, and they had every right to charge me rent. Mom joined in, saying I was acting like a spoiled brat who thought she was too good to help her own family. I stayed calm even though my heart was pounding. I told them I just wanted to understand everything before signing a legal contract. Dad slammed his coffee mug on the counter and coffee splashed everywhere. He started toward me, but I grabbed my backpack and left for school early. I heard him yelling behind me as I walked down the driveway, but didn't look back. My hands were shaking again as I unlocked my bike. The ride to school usually took 15 minutes, but I made it in 10 because I was pedaling so hard. I spent my morning classes barely paying attention, trying to figure out who I could trust with this. My math teacher was explaining something about equations, but I was just staring at my notebook. In English, we were supposed to be doing group work, but I told my group I didn't feel well and sat by myself. The school counselor, Mrs. Gilmore, had always been kind whenever I'd seen her in the halls, so during lunch, I walked to her office. The main office secretary asked if I had an appointment. I told her it was kind of an emergency, and she looked at me for a second before picking up the phone. 5 minutes later, Mrs. Gilmore came out and brought me into her office. She was probably in her 40s with gray hair and was wearing a cardigan even though it was warm out. Her office had plants on the windowsill and motivational posters on the walls. Mrs. Gilmore listened to everything without interrupting, and when I finished, she looked genuinely concerned. I told her about being 13 when they stopped buying lunch and supplies, about working since middle school to afford food and clothes, about them ordering takeout while I ate peanut butter, about the locked pantry and the contract Dad wanted me to sign. She wrote things down in a notebook and nodded. When I finished talking, she asked if I felt safe at home and whether my parents had ever been physically violent, which they hadn't. She asked if they'd ever hit me or threatened to hurt me. I told her no, they'd never done that. They just stopped supporting me financially and now wanted me to pay them. Mrs. Gilmore's expression grew more serious and she tapped her pen on the desk. She explained that while she wasn't a lawyer, charging rent to a minor raised serious questions about parental obligations. She said parents are supposed to provide basic necessities until their kids turn 18. If they're charging rent but not providing food or clothes, that could be considered neglect. She opened a drawer and pulled out some pamphlets about free legal aid services. She asked if I'd be comfortable with her making some calls to connect me with someone who could give real legal advice. I told her yes, please. I needed help figuring this out. Mrs. Gilmore picked up her phone and stepped outside for a minute. Through the window in her door, I could see her talking to someone and writing things down. When she came back, she told me she'd left a message with legal aid and they should call back within a day or two. I agreed and felt a huge weight lift just from telling someone the truth. For 3 years, I'd been handling everything alone and pretending it was normal. Having an adult actually listen and take me seriously made me want to cry, but I held it together. Mrs. Gilmore also helped me apply for free lunch right there in her office, which I should have done years earlier but had been too embarrassed about. She pulled up the form on her computer and helped me fill it out. She said it was nothing to be ashamed of and that plenty of students use the program. The application asked about household income and family size. Mrs. Gilmore helped me explain that my parents didn't provide food money even though they lived in the house. She submitted it electronically and said I should be approved within a few days. When I left her office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Someone knew. Someone was helping. I wasn't completely alone anymore. 2 days later, I met with Boyd from Legal Aid, who explained that parents must provide food, shelter, and basic necessities to minor children. Mrs. Gilmore had set up the meeting and driven me to the Legal Aid office downtown after school. Boyd was younger than I'd expected, maybe in his 30s, with glasses and a tie. His office was small, with boxes of files stacked everywhere. He had me sit down and pulled out a yellow notepad. He asked me to start from the beginning and tell him everything. I went through the whole story again, and he took notes the entire time. When I got to the part about the rent contract, he stopped writing and looked up. Charging rent could be considered neglect if it prevents them from meeting those obligations, he said. He explained that parents have a legal duty to support their minor children. They can't just decide to stop providing necessities and charge rent instead. Boyd asked detailed questions about what my parents actually provided versus what I paid for myself. When I listed everything food, clothes, school supplies, toiletries, his expression grew more serious. He wrote it all down in 2 columns labeled provided and not provided. The not provided column was much longer. He asked about their income and whether they were genuinely struggling or simply choosing not to spend money on me. I told him about the sports package and the golf membership and the restaurant meals, about how they'd had plenty of money until Dad got laid off a few months back. Boyd nodded and kept writing. He asked if I had any proof of what I was telling him. I showed him the screenshots from my phone, their takeout orders piled in the trash while my cabinet sat empty, photos of the locked pantry, my budget notebook showing every dollar I'd earned and spent for 2 years. Boyd looked through everything carefully and his jaw tightened. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. Boyd told me this documentation was solid evidence and exactly what we'd need if things got worse. He explained he could write a formal letter to my parents outlining their legal duties as parents of a minor child. The letter would cite specific state laws about providing food, shelter, clothing, and basic necessities. It wouldn't force them to change, but it might make them realize they couldn't just kick me out or demand all my money. Boyd said the letter would be professional and factual, not threatening, but it would make clear that their actions could be considered neglect. He asked if I wanted him to send it, and I nodded immediately. Having something official from a lawyer felt like protection I'd never had before. Boyd printed out some information sheets about my rights and told me to keep documenting everything. He also gave me his direct phone number in case things escalated quickly. The meeting ended with him promising to mail the letter within 2 days. That evening at home, I was heating up ramen in the microwave when both my parents walked into the kitchen. They had that look again, the serious one that meant they were about to corner me. Dad crossed his arms and asked if I'd thought about the rent contract. I took a breath and told them I'd talked to a lawyer at Legal Aid. Mom's face went pale and Dad's jaw tightened. I explained that I'd learned parents have to provide basic necessities whether their kid pays rent or not. Dad's face turned red and he started yelling about how I was threatening them and trying to make them look like bad parents. His voice got louder with each word and I could feel my heart pounding, but I kept my expression calm. Mom started crying, saying I was so ungrateful after they'd kept a roof over my head for 15 years. She was doing that thing where she cries to make me feel guilty, but I'd seen it too many times to fall for it anymore. Dad stepped closer and said I was tearing the family apart over money. I stayed calm and repeated exactly what Boyd had told me. I was willing to help with chores around the house and contribute in reasonable ways, but I wasn't signing a contract that took all my earnings. My voice stayed steady even though my hands were shaking. I told them I needed my money for food and school supplies since they'd stopped providing those things years ago. Dad opened his mouth to yell again, but I just turned and walked toward my room. They were both shouting behind me about disrespect and ingratitude, but I kept walking. I heard them storm off to their bedroom and slam the door so hard the whole house shook. I locked my bedroom door and sat on my bed with my phone, texting Mrs. Gilmore that the confrontation had happened and I was okay. She texted back immediately asking if I felt safe, and I told her yes, just shaken up. The house stayed silent for the rest of the night. The next week dragged by with my parents barely speaking to me. Then, one afternoon I was at school when Boyd's letter arrived via certified mail. I knew because when I got home that evening the whole house felt different. The air was thick and tense and my parents were sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of them. They didn't look at me when I walked in. They didn't say anything. I grabbed a snack from the limited supplies I could reach and went straight to my room. The silence was somehow worse than yelling. At dinner time, which I usually skipped anyway, I heard them talking in low angry voices but couldn't make out the words. This went on for days, with them treating me like I was invisible while also watching my every move. Mrs. Gilmore started checking in with me every single day during lunch period. She pulled me into her office and we worked on setting up a realistic schedule that balanced school, work, and study time. My grades had been dropping because I was too exhausted and stressed to focus on homework. She emailed my teachers explaining I was dealing with family issues and helped me get extensions on missing assignments. We mapped out which classes needed the most attention and when I could use free periods to catch up. She also connected me with the school's homework help program where I could get free tutoring. Mrs. Gilmore made a spreadsheet of my entire week showing school hours, work shifts, study blocks, and even time for sleep. Seeing it all laid out made me realize how much I'd been trying to handle alone. She printed 2 copies, one for me and one she kept in case we needed to adjust things. My neighbor Eliana noticed I was bringing my lawn equipment to her garage more often than usual. One afternoon, while I was storing my mower and trimmer, she came outside and asked if everything was okay at home. I gave her a vague answer about my parents being stressed about money. Eliana looked at me for a long moment like she was deciding whether to push for more. She didn't push, but her expression told me she understood more than I was saying. She mentioned that her garage had plenty of room if I wanted to keep all my equipment there permanently instead of just sometimes. I thanked her and accepted the offer, grateful to have my expensive tools somewhere my parents couldn't mess with them. The next week, Eliana started offering me more consistent work. She asked if I could mow her lawn every week instead of every other week, and help with some garden maintenance too. She paid me up front for the whole month, which helped me budget better and feel less panicked about money. While I was working in her yard one Saturday, she brought out lemonade and casually mentioned her guest room was available if I ever needed a place to stay. She said it lightly, like she was just making conversation, but her eyes were serious. I told her thank you and that I really appreciated it. Having that option in the back of my mind made me feel less trapped. At home, things got worse in quieter ways. My parents installed a lock on the pantry door and started counting every item in the fridge. They didn't technically deny me food completely, but they made it clear what I was allowed to touch. Certain shelves in the fridge were off limits, and the pantry stayed locked except when they were home to supervise. It was their way of controlling what I ate without breaking any obvious rules. I'd come home from work starving and find the pantry locked with a note saying they'd be home at 8. Meanwhile, I could smell their leftover Chinese food in the fridge, but knew I wasn't allowed to touch it. I started documenting everything on my phone just like Boyd told me to. I took photos of the locked pantry with timestamps. I photographed the empty cabinets I was allowed to access, showing there was basically nothing there. When my parents ordered takeout, I took pictures of the bags and containers in the trash, then photos of my own dinner, usually peanut butter on bread or plain pasta. I screenshotted our bank statements showing their restaurant charges. Every piece of evidence got saved in a folder on my phone and backed up to a cloud account they couldn't access. Boyd said evidence matters if things escalate to court or child services. I never thought I'd be building a case against my own parents, but here I was, taking photos in my own kitchen like I was collecting proof of a crime. The next shift at the grocery store, Christian stopped by my register during a slow period and leaned against the counter. He watched me scan my usual lunch items, the cheapest things in the store, then looked at me with an expression that wasn't pity, but something closer to understanding. He mentioned they had openings for more hours if I was interested, and the pay would help with whatever I was dealing with. I accepted immediately because more stable income meant less panic about making rent or affording food. He told me to stop by his office after my shift to fill out paperwork, and I thanked him while bagging my crackers and peanut butter. I filled out the forms that same afternoon, and Christian helped me get my work permit updated to allow more hours since I was still 15. The new schedule started the following week with 3 weekday evenings and full shifts on weekends, meaning real money coming in regularly. But it also meant less time for homework, and I was already behind in 2 classes from all the stress at home. Mrs. Gilmore noticed when I fell asleep during study hall and pulled me aside to ask what was going on. I explained about the increased work hours, and she didn't lecture me about priorities or tell me to quit my job like some adults might have. Instead, she helped me map out a study schedule using every free period and lunch break to catch up on assignments. She even talked to my teachers about extensions on some projects so I wasn't drowning in late work. 3 days later, I came home from an evening shift and found Dad waiting in the driveway with his arms crossed. He started yelling before I even got out of the car about how he'd heard I was getting free lunch at school now. Someone from church must have seen my name on a list, because he knew details I'd never told him. He said I was making them look like deadbeats who couldn't even feed their own kid, and that I was embarrassing the whole family with my poverty act. I tried to walk past him toward the house, but he blocked my path, and kept going about how people at church were probably gossiping about what terrible parents they must be. His voice got louder with each sentence, and I noticed Eliana's porch light flick on across the street. She came outside and just stood there on her porch, arms folded, watching us. Dad noticed her standing there, and his voice dropped to an angry whisper, but I could see his jaw clenching, and his fists tight at his sides. He told me this conversation wasn't over and stormed back inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. The following weekend, I came home from mowing lawns to find my equipment sitting in the middle of the yard, completely soaked from the rainstorm that had come through that morning. My parents swore they didn't know it was going to rain, that they'd needed to get the car out of the garage for errands. But my mower wouldn't start, and when I checked the engine, I could see water damage that would cost more to fix than the mower was worth. I sat on the wet grass staring at my ruined equipment, feeling like I might actually cry for the first time in months. This mower represented half my business, and replacing it would take weeks of saving. Eliana came over an hour later and found me still sitting there trying to figure out what to do. She looked at the destroyed mower, then at my parents' car parked in the driveway, and didn't ask a single question about how it happened. She told me to bring all my equipment to her garage right then, that I could store everything there permanently, so this never happened again. I loaded up my trimmer and remaining tools and followed her across the street, feeling grateful that at least one adult in my life actually helped instead of sabotaging me. Back at work, Christian called me into his office and offered me a permanent part-time position with set hours every week and a small raise. The stability meant I could actually plan my budget instead of scrambling for irregular yard work money. I could count on a specific amount each paycheck and know exactly what I'd have for food and supplies. He also mentioned employee discounts on groceries, which would stretch my food money even further. That same week, I was organizing my room when I noticed Dad had been going through my things. My bank statements were out of order, and there were fingerprints on papers I kept in my desk drawer. I confronted him about it, and he acted like it was his right to know what I was doing with my money since I lived in his house. Boyd's voice echoed in my head about keeping my finances separate, so I went online and opened a prepaid debit card account that only I could access. I transferred most of my savings and set up direct deposit from work, so my parents couldn't track my income anymore. Boyd said documentation matters, and this was one more layer of protection. Sunday morning at church, someone apparently asked Dad directly about the rent situation, because he came home absolutely furious about people gossiping about our private business. He slammed things around the kitchen while Mom sat at the table looking embarrassed, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. She kept saying they should never have mentioned anything to anyone, but Dad insisted they hadn't said a word, which meant someone else was talking. I stayed in my room and listened to them argue about who might have found out and how to handle the rumors now spreading through their social circle. Mrs. Gilmore scheduled a mediation meeting at the school the following Wednesday with my parents, herself, and a social worker from the district. We all sat around a conference table, and the social worker explained she was there to help us reach an agreement that worked for everyone. My parents immediately launched into complaints about how disrespectful I'd been and how I refused to help the family during hard times. Dad brought up every perceived slight from the past month while Mom nodded along, adding her own examples. The social worker listened patiently, then redirected by asking what specific support my parents currently provided. The room went quiet as they struggled to list actual things they paid for beyond the roof over my head. The social worker asked about food access, clothing, school supplies, and my parents gave vague answers about teaching responsibility. She asked me directly what I purchased for myself, and I listed everything while my parents sat there looking uncomfortable. After an hour of back and forth, we reached a temporary agreement. I wouldn't pay rent for now, but I'd do more chores around the house to contribute. The social worker wrote everything down in detail, including which chores, how often, and what my parents agreed to provide in return. She printed copies for all of us and explained this was a working agreement we'd revisit in a month. My parents signed it looking annoyed but cooperative, and I took my copy knowing this piece of paper gave me something official to point to if they tried changing the terms later. A few days later, I was coming home from school when I saw Dad loading his golf clubs into someone's car in the driveway. He handed over the clubs and took cash from the buyer, then watched the car drive away with a bitter look on his face. Inside, he counted the money at the kitchen table, and I heard him mutter something about paying the credit card company before they sued him. He didn't ask me for money that whole week, which felt like progress, even though I could tell he was upset about losing his golf stuff. Mom surprised everyone by announcing she'd gotten hired at a retail store in the mall doing part-time work. She started the following Monday and came home that first day complaining about standing for 6 hours straight and dealing with rude customers. Every evening after her shifts, she talked about how tired she was and how her feet hurt, but it was strange seeing her actually work for the first time in years. The extra money helped because we started eating cheaper meals at home more often instead of them ordering takeout. Mom made pasta with basic sauce, rice and beans, simple chicken dishes that didn't cost much. It wasn't fancy, but it meant I wasn't hiding in my room eating peanut butter sandwiches while they enjoyed restaurant food. I actually sat at the table with them during dinner, which hadn't happened in forever. One evening, Mom and I ended up alone in the kitchen washing dishes after Dad went to watch TV. She was scrubbing a pot and mentioned out of nowhere that her parents had been really strict about money when she was growing up. She said they made her account for every dollar and never let her buy anything fun. It wasn't an apology, and she didn't connect it to how she'd treated me, but it was the closest she'd ever come to explaining why she acted the way she did. I just nodded and kept drying plates because I didn't know what to say to that. Dad got a call about an interview at a warehouse across town, and his whole mood changed. He actually seemed hopeful for the first time in weeks, talking about the pay rate and benefits while looking at the company website. The tension in the house dropped a little while we waited to hear back about whether he made it to the next round. I used some of my savings to take my lawnmower to the repair shop, because the engine had been acting weird. The guy fixed it, and I also bought better equipment that would last longer, a new trimmer and some professional-grade tools. Eliana saw me unloading everything and offered to let me organize her garage so all my business supplies were in one place and easy to access. We spent a Saturday afternoon setting up shelves and hanging tools on the wall. She labeled everything and even made a schedule board where I could track which clients needed service each week. At work, Christian started teaching me about payroll and taxes during slow shifts when there weren't many customers. He showed me how to read my pay stub and explained withholding and deductions. He talked about budgeting strategies and how to plan for big expenses. He treated me like an actual adult employee instead of just some kid, which felt good after being treated like a burden at home for so long. Boyd called to check in and asked how things were going with my parents. I told him about the mediation agreement and he said we should create a safety plan just in case they tried to kick me out anyway. He had me write down Eliana's number, Mrs. Gilmore's cell phone, and the address of a youth shelter downtown. He explained exactly what to do if I came home and the locks had been changed or my stuff was gone. Knowing I had a plan made me feel less scared about what might happen. My parents started cooking at home more regularly, and one day I noticed the lock was gone from the pantry. Mom actually asked if I wanted anything special from the grocery store next time she went, which was so strange I almost didn't believe it was happening. She wrote down that I liked the wheat bread and a certain brand of peanut butter. It felt strange but good to have normal food access like a regular kid. Then I was walking past the kitchen counter and saw the cable bill sitting there with the payment amount circled. I picked it up and noticed they'd reactivated the sports package Dad had canceled a few weeks earlier. All that progress selling the golf clubs, cutting expenses, and they were already slipping back into old patterns. The bill was almost $60 higher than before, and they hadn't even mentioned it to me. I put the paper back down and walked to my room, feeling that familiar frustration building in my chest. They couldn't help themselves even when they were supposed to be learning to manage money better. 2 days later, I was doing homework in my room when I heard raised voices from the kitchen. Dad was yelling about the bank sending an overdraft notice and Mom's voice got louder, saying she didn't know the account was that low. I cracked my door open and heard Dad accusing her of spending too much at Target while she fired back about his bar tab from the previous weekend. They went back and forth listing every purchase the other had made, neither one taking responsibility for their own spending. The argument lasted almost an hour before they both stormed off to separate rooms, and I realized they'd learned absolutely nothing from the past few weeks. The next morning, Dad cornered me before school and started talking about how the household bills kept climbing. He said I needed to start contributing something because expenses were too high for just the two of them to handle. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo I'd taken of our written agreement from the mediation meeting, the one stating no rent until I'm 18. He turned red, but I stayed calm and told him I wasn't discussing it further since we'd already agreed on terms. He muttered something about ungrateful kids and walked away, but I could tell he was planning something else. That evening, Mom caught me in the hallway with a fake, cheerful expression and started explaining a new system she'd thought of. She said instead of calling it rent, we could do chore credits, where I'd earn points for household tasks that counted toward covering expenses. I stared at her for a second before saying that sounded exactly like rent with extra steps, and the answer was still no. Her smile dropped and she huffed off to complain to Dad about how difficult I was being. I went to my room and texted Boyd about what just happened, and he responded within minutes saying I should start documenting everything in detail. I opened a new note on my phone and began writing down what food was currently in the cabinets, what time my parents ordered pizza for dinner while I ate cereal, and I took photos of the bills they left on the counter showing their spending patterns. Boyd said if we needed to escalate the situation, having solid evidence would protect me from their version of events. I made entries every day noting when they bought takeout, when the pantry had food I could access, and any comments they made about money or my supposed obligations. The documentation made me feel less powerless because at least I was building a record of what was actually happening versus what they claimed. 3 days later, I was at school when Mrs. Gilmore called me to her office and showed me an email she was drafting to my parents. The message was professional and polite, but the warning was crystal clear, stating that if the agreed terms from our mediation were violated in any way, she'd be required to file a formal report with Child Welfare Services. She asked if I was okay with her sending it, and I nodded yes, knowing my parents would be furious, but also knowing they needed this boundary enforced by someone with authority. She hit send while I was sitting there and I watched the email disappear into the void, heading toward my parents' inbox where it would definitely cause an explosion. That Saturday I was working my shift at the grocery store, restocking shelves in the cereal aisle, when I saw Dad walk through the front doors. My stomach dropped because he wasn't there to shop, based on the angry expression on his face and the way he was scanning the store looking for me. He spotted me and walked straight over, his voice rising as he started going off about how I was making them look like terrible parents, turning everyone against them. Customers were stopping to stare and I felt my face burning with embarrassment as he kept ranting about ingratitude and disrespect. Christian appeared from the back room and walked up calmly, positioning himself slightly between me and Dad. He told my father in a firm but polite voice that he needed to leave the store, and Dad started arguing that he had a right to talk to his own daughter. Christian didn't back down, just repeated that he needed to leave now or Christian would call the police for causing a disturbance. Dad looked like he wanted to argue more, but something in Christian's expression made him turn around and storm out, shoving the door open hard enough that it banged against the wall. I was shaking so badly I had to sit down on a step stool, and both Christian and Eliana, who happened to be in the store, came over to check on me. Christian said I'd done nothing wrong and they had my back completely, while another coworker pulled out the incident report form and started writing down everything that happened with times and details. She told me in a matter-of-fact way that if Dad came back to the store they wouldn't hesitate to call the police for trespassing, and knowing they were serious about protecting me made me feel safer than I had in months. After my shift, I went straight to Mrs. Gilmore's house since she'd given me her address for emergencies, and I told her everything about the store incident. Her expression grew more concerned as I talked. And when I finished, she said she needed to file that report with child welfare now, because my dad showing up at my workplace to confront me crossed a serious line. The next day, a woman named Kathleen called my cell phone and introduced herself as a caseworker, explaining she needed to schedule a home visit to assess the situation. My whole body felt cold and relieved at the same time, because I'd wanted help, but I was also scared about what would happen next and whether this would make everything worse. Kathleen scheduled the visit for Thursday afternoon and said she'd need to speak with me privately at the house and review some financial information with my parents. When I told my parents about the visit, they immediately went into panic mode. Mom started deep cleaning every room like we were preparing for a military inspection, scrubbing baseboards and organizing closets that hadn't been touched in years. Dad coached her on what to say, practicing answers about how they provided everything I needed, and that I was just being dramatic about normal family disagreements. I listened to them rehearse their version of events and decided I wasn't playing along with any of it. When Kathleen arrived on Thursday, I was just going to tell her the truth calmly and let her draw her own conclusions based on facts instead of my parents' spin. Thursday came and Kathleen showed up right on time. A woman in her 40s with a professional but kind demeanor, carrying a tablet and folder. She talked to all three of us together first, asking basic questions about our household and daily routines. Then she asked to speak with me alone in my room. I showed her my budget notebook, my documentation of food access and spending patterns, and the photos of bills on my phone. She didn't look shocked or judgmental, just took notes and asked clarifying questions about specific incidents and timelines. After talking to me for almost an hour, she inspected the house room by room, checking the pantry and fridge and taking photos of her own. Finally, she sat down with my parents in the living room and I was asked to join them. Kathleen spoke directly and clearly, telling my parents that charging rent to a minor child was inappropriate and potentially constituted neglect of their legal duties. She explained they had to ensure I had regular access to food and basic necessities, and she'd be monitoring the situation with follow-up visits. My parents nodded and agreed to everything she said, their faces showing a mix of embarrassment and resentment, but I could tell they understood she wasn't making suggestions. She was setting requirements they had to follow. Kathleen packed up her tablet and folder and walked to the door while my parents followed her with tight smiles on their faces. The second her car pulled away from the curb, the fake politeness dropped completely. Mom went straight to the pantry and removed the lock without saying a word, throwing it in the trash with more force than necessary. Dad pulled out his phone and started scrolling through job listings while sitting at the kitchen table with his jaw clenched. Neither of them looked at me or acknowledged what had just happened, but I could feel their anger filling every corner of the house. Over the next few days, they bought groceries and left them where I could reach them, but arranged the items in a way that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to know they were only doing this because they had to. Mom made a point of sighing loudly whenever she put food in the fridge, and Dad muttered under his breath about government overreach and people not minding their own business. The rent contract disappeared from the counter, but nobody mentioned it, as if pretending it never existed would somehow erase the whole situation. I kept my documentation updated anyway, taking photos of the unlocked pantry and stocked fridge just in case things changed again. 2 weeks after Kathleen's visit, Dad started his warehouse job on the night shift loading trucks. He left for work at 10 p.m. and got home around 7 a.m., sleeping most of the day before getting up to eat dinner and leave again. The exhaustion showed in everything he did, from the way he moved slower to how he fell asleep on the couch before his alarm went off. The good part was that he was too tired to start arguments about money or anything else, which made the evenings quieter than they'd been in months. Mom seemed relieved to have him out of the house at night, and she stopped walking on eggshells waiting for the next fight to start. I came home from school one afternoon to find Mom sitting at the kitchen table with worksheets spread out in front of her. She explained that her employer offered free financial literacy classes during lunch breaks, and she'd decided to attend one. The worksheets covered basic budgeting, tracking expenses, and setting savings goals, all things I'd figured out years ago by necessity. But seeing Mom actually engaged with the material and taking notes surprised me, because she'd never shown interest in managing money before. She asked me a few questions about how I tracked my business income and expenses, and for the first time we had a normal conversation about finances without anyone getting defensive or angry. It didn't fix everything, but it felt like a small step towards something better. My daily routine settled into a predictable pattern over the next month. I'd wake up, go to school, work my afternoon shift at the grocery store, come home to do homework, handle my assigned chores, and get to bed at a reasonable hour. The stability meant I wasn't constantly exhausted anymore, and my grades started climbing back up from where they dropped during all the stress. Teachers noticed the improvement, and a few of them mentioned how glad they were to see me doing better. I wasn't constantly calculating how to stretch $20 or worrying about whether there'd be food when I got home. Life wasn't perfect, and my parents still barely talked to me beyond basic household communication, but at least it was predictable, and I could focus on school and work without constant crisis management. One Saturday morning, Eliana texted me asking if I wanted to spend the weekend at her house just to relax and decompress. She said her husband was visiting his sister and she'd enjoy the company. Plus, she knew things had been tense at my house. I asked my parents, expecting them to make a big deal out of it, but Dad just shrugged and said fine, while Mom nodded without looking up from her budgeting worksheet. I packed a bag and walked over to Eliana's house that afternoon, feeling lighter with each step away from my own front door. The weekend turned out to be exactly what I needed. Just 2 days of watching movies, helping Eliana with some gardening projects, and eating meals without any tension in the air. She didn't pry about my home situation, but made it clear I was welcome at her house anytime I needed a break. Sunday evening, I headed back home feeling completely recharged and ready to handle whatever came next. 3 weeks later, Kathleen showed up for her follow-up visit and sat down with all three of us in the living room. She reviewed her notes from the first visit and asked specific questions about food access, my school performance, and household expenses. My parents answered politely and showed her the unlocked pantry, the stocked fridge, and Mom's budget worksheets. Kathleen seemed pleased with the improvements but reminded everyone that the case stayed open for continued monitoring, and she'd be checking in regularly over the next several months. After she left, my parents went back to their quiet resentment, but didn't reverse anything, apparently understanding that Kathleen hadn't been making suggestions. I met with Mrs. Gilmore during lunch one day to talk about my plans for junior and senior year. She mentioned a dual enrollment program that lets high school students take college classes at the community college, earning both high school and college credit at the same time. The program covers tuition, and there are scholarships available for books and transportation. Mrs. Gilmore helped me fill out the application right there in her office and wrote a strong recommendation letter highlighting my work ethic and academic improvement. I submitted everything before the deadline and tried not to get my hopes up too much, but the idea of getting a head start on college while still in high school felt like exactly the kind of opportunity I needed. About a week after I submitted the application, Mom approached me in the kitchen and asked if I could loan them some money to cover an unexpected car repair. Dad stood behind her nodding, and they both had that familiar desperate look I remembered from when Dad first lost his job. I told them I could write up a formal loan agreement with the amount, interest rate, and repayment schedule so we'd all be clear on the terms. I pulled out my laptop and started typing up a simple contract while they watched. Their expressions shifted from hopeful to uncomfortable, and Dad finally said, "Never mind, they'd figure something else out." They walked away, and I saved the blank loan agreement template for next time, knowing that having everything in writing protected both them and me. The following weekend, I noticed the big TV was gone from the living room. Mom explained that they'd sold it to help pay down their credit card debt, and Dad had canceled the expensive sports package permanently. The living room looked empty without the huge screen, and I could tell they both hated having made these changes. But it was real progress toward getting their finances under control, even if they clearly resented every step. Dad complained about missing his games, and Mom mentioned several times how small the old TV in their bedroom looked compared to what they'd had. I didn't point out that these were the kinds of sacrifices I'd been making since I was 13, because that would just start another fight. 2 months after submitting my application, I got an email saying I'd been accepted into the dual enrollment program with a full scholarship covering books and transportation costs. Starting next fall, I'd spend my mornings taking college classes at the community college and my afternoons finishing high school requirements. The acceptance letter included information about course selection and orientation dates. I printed it out and showed my parents, hoping they'd be proud or at least acknowledge it as an achievement. Dad glanced at it and said, "That's good," while Mom nodded and mentioned it would save them money on college later. Their reactions stung a little because this was a big deal, and I'd worked hard to make it happen, but I was learning not to expect validation from them. A week later, we all sat down at the kitchen table with a printed document listing everything in clear terms. No rent until I turn 18. My chores include taking out trash on Tuesdays and Thursdays, doing my own laundry, and helping with dinner dishes 3 nights a week. Food access means the pantry and fridge stay unlocked, and I can eat what's available without asking permission. My work income belongs to me, and I'm not expected to contribute to household bills. Mom read through it twice, and Dad shifted in his chair looking uncomfortable, but he didn't argue. We all signed at the bottom, and I took a picture with my phone before Mom drove me to school to give the original to Mrs. Gilmore for her files. Mrs. Gilmore looked it over and nodded, filing it away in a folder with my name on it. She told me to contact her immediately if anything changed or if my parents tried to modify the terms without agreement. The next Thursday, we had dinner together at the regular time with baked chicken and rice that Mom made using groceries from the store. Dad talked about a problem at the warehouse with a forklift that broke down. Mom mentioned a difficult customer at her retail job who wanted to return something without a receipt. I told them about a quiz I'd done well on in history class, and a new client who wanted weekly lawn service starting in spring. Nobody yelled or brought up money or made cutting remarks about my clothes or food. It wasn't warm and we weren't laughing or sharing deep thoughts, but we were sitting together eating a meal and talking about normal everyday things without tension crackling in the air. After dinner, I helped load the dishwasher like the agreement said, then went to my room to finish homework. Looking ahead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, cautious hope about my situation. I had adults watching out for me now, with Mrs. Gilmore checking in weekly and Kathleen doing monthly home visits. I had a clear path to college through the dual enrollment program starting next fall. My parents were managing money better with someone holding them accountable, even if they still resented the oversight. I'd learned I could stand up for myself when necessary, and that asking for help wasn't the same as being weak or helpless. Things weren't perfect and probably never would be with my parents, but I was building a future that didn't depend on them staying consistent or suddenly becoming different people. That felt like the best outcome I could realistically achieve, given where we started.